They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't salute. But when the call came, they answered. When America went to war in 1941, not all of its soldiers were human. Some had fur, some had feathers, and some in the years to come would even have fins. They came from farms, from family homes, from police kennels and city streets. They had no idea what the word war meant, but they learned. They learned to crawl through mud under fire, to sniff out hidden mines, to carry messages through storms of steel and fire, and to stand beside the soldiers of the United States when fear and chaos consumed the world. This is their story. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the country faced an urgent problem. Its military had machines, men, and munitions, but it lacked something living, something that could sense danger before it struck, something that could go where radios could not, and move where vehicles could not. Across the nation, a quiet recruitment began, not for soldiers, but for animals. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps launched a program that would change the face of warfare. They called it the War Dog Program. To the men who trained them, these dogs weren't just pets. They were comrades. At Camp Rimini, Montana, and Fort Robinson, Nebraska, hundreds of volunteers arrived every month. They brought their family dogs, German Shepherds, Dobermans, Collies, and Huskies. The Army called them dogs for defense, and soon they were transformed into soldiers. Training began with obedience and courage. They learned to jump from trucks, ignore explosions, and crawl under barbed wire. Trainers taught them to stay silent under gunfire, to detect hidden enemies, to track lost men, and to guard sleeping camps through the dark, humid nights. By 1943, America had more than 10,000 dogs in uniform. Most were trained as sentries, guarding airfields, depots, and supply bases from sabotage. But others were chosen for something far more dangerous. In the steaming jungles of the Pacific, where visibility was measured in feet and ambushes could come from any direction, Marines needed a new kind of warning system. They needed something with a nose sharper than radar. So they brought the dogs. The Marine Corps 1st War Dog Platoon landed on Bougainville in November 1943. The dogs, mostly Dobermans and Shepherds, learned to move in silence ahead of patrols. Their handlers, often barely older than the dogs themselves, trusted them with their lives. When a dog stopped and raised its head, the Marines froze. That single motion could mean the difference between life and death. They learned to read each other's breathing, each other's fear. One Marine later said, "A dog could see what we couldn't, hear what we missed, and smell what was coming before we ever did." On one patrol in Guam, a Doberman named Kurt moved silently ahead of his unit. Suddenly he stiffened. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward, barking once, then twice. Moments later, a burst of gunfire erupted from the trees. Kurt fell, but his warning had saved the entire platoon. They buried him there, beneath the jungle soil he had protected. And on his grave, they placed a small handmade cross. It read simply, "Kurt, 1st War Dog, 3rd Marine Division." Stories like Kurt's spread quickly. Soon, the Marine Corps created official war dog platoons across the Pacific. From Bougainville to Saipan, Iwo Jima to Okinawa, more than 500 dogs served beside Marines. One of them, a small Yorkshire Terrier named Smokey, became a legend. Found in an abandoned foxhole in New Guinea, Smokey was adopted by an American airman. She was just 4 pounds, but her courage weighed far more. In one mission, engineers needed to run a communications cable through a narrow underground pipe, nearly 70 feet long. It was too small for a human to crawl through and too dangerous to dig up. So they tied a string to Smokey's collar. They called her name softly, and without hesitation. She trotted into the darkness. Minutes passed. The soldiers waited, barely breathing. Then, from the far end of the pipe, a tiny nose appeared. Smokey had made it. She had carried the line that allowed the airfield to stay connected under enemy fire. For that, Smokey became a hero, not just to her crew, but to soldiers across the Pacific who heard her story. At night, she slept beside her handler, curled in his helmet. During raids, she stayed calm, even as bombs fell around them. And when the war ended, Smokey returned home, one of the smallest and bravest veterans of them all. These were not just dogs, they were brothers in arms. And for everyone that came home, another never did. They had no rank, no medals pinned to their collars. But to the men they fought beside, they were heroes. As the war raged across two oceans, America's four-legged soldiers spread with it. From the steaming jungles of the Pacific to the frozen fields of Europe, dogs became part of nearly every branch of the U.S. military. In North Africa and Italy, American units relied on messenger dogs to carry orders through shell fire when radios were down. They ran through smoke and rubble, guided only by instinct and loyalty. One such dog, a German shepherd named Caesar, carried messages for the Fifth Army near Anzio. He made dozens of runs through bombardment zones until one night. He didn't return. The next morning, soldiers found him lying beside a fallen message tube. The note inside had been delivered. He had done his duty to the very end. In France, dogs were used to locate wounded soldiers trapped on the battlefield. They could move silently through ruins and forests, alerting medics to men who could no longer call out. Their hearing was so sharp, their handlers said they could sense movement hundreds of yards away. When a dog barked once, just once, it meant a life had been found. At night, they became guardians. Sentry dogs patrolled ammunition dumps and airfields, keeping watch for intruders. In the blackness of a European winter, their growls were often the first and only warning of an enemy near the wire. But perhaps the most grueling work came in the Pacific. There, heat, disease, and terrain tested both man and animal to their limits. The air smelled of rot and jungle rain. The ground was never dry. Snipers hid in trees. Mines lay buried under roots and leaves. To the Marines, their dogs were not tools. They were lifelines. A Doberman named Andy saved his patrol when he refused to move forward on a trail in Guam. His handler trusted the signal, and the Marines halted. Moments later, they discovered a hidden Japanese ambush just 30 feet ahead. Andy's hesitation had saved 20 men. These stories were not rare. They became legend inside the platoons, whispered around campfires, remembered in silence after battle. But life for the dogs was harsh. There were no medics for them, no stretchers carried through the mud. When they were wounded, handlers used their own rations to feed them, tore bandages from their kits to treat them. The bond between man and animal was absolute. On Iwo Jima, a dog named Flame patrolled with the Marines of the 5th Division. For days, he worked without rest, warning troops of Japanese positions hidden in the volcanic rock. When a mortar round struck near him, Flame was thrown into the air. He limped back, bloodied but alive. The men carried him to the rear, refusing to leave him behind. To them, he wasn't a dog anymore. He was one of them. When the battles ended, not all dogs returned home. Many were left behind, too traumatized, too changed to live among civilians again. Some had to be euthanized, others adopted by their handlers, who couldn't bear to part with them. It was a quiet tragedy that few spoke of. In 1947, the Marine Corps declassified its war dog records. Among them were hundreds of reports. each describing courage, obedience, and loyalty beyond measure. One officer wrote simply, "We could not have done the job without them." While the dogs fought on the ground, another group of animals took to the skies. They had no teeth or claws, no collars or leashes. But they carried something far more valuable, messages that could turn the tide of battle. High above the trenches and fields, flew America's secret messengers, the carrier pigeons. Since World War I, the U.S. Army Signal Corps had maintained a pigeon service. By 1941, thousands of trained pigeons were ready for duty once again. To the untrained eye, they were ordinary birds. But to the military, they were the most reliable couriers in the world. Each pigeon was trained to return to its home loft from nearly 200 miles away. No weather, no gunfire, no smoke could confuse them. When radios failed or cables were cut, pigeons carried messages that saved entire units. They traveled in small wicker cages attached to jeeps, tanks, or paratroopers' belts. When needed, a note written on thin paper was placed in a tiny metal capsule tied to their leg. Then the bird was released and vanished into the sky. Their missions were often deadly. Pigeons were hunted by hawks, shot at by enemy snipers, torn apart by explosions mid-flight. Yet thousands completed their missions. Their success rate was over 95%, higher than any human courier could ever match. One pigeon story would become the stuff of legend. His name was Ji Gaomi Zhou. In 1943, during the Italian campaign, British forces occupied the town of Calvi Vecchia. An airstrike had been ordered to destroy it, but the orders hadn't reached the pilots in time. The British sent a desperate message to stop the bombing. Their radios were dead. Their only hope was a pigeon. G.I. Joe was released at 10:30 a.m. He flew more than 20 miles in less than 20 minutes, straight through enemy fire. Just as the bombers began their final approach, the message was delivered. The airstrike was called off. Over 1,000 Allied soldiers were saved. For his courage, G.I. Joe became the first U.S. pigeon to receive the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Another pigeon, Cher Ami, had already made history in the previous war. Her preserved body still rests in the Smithsonian, a silent reminder of how these fragile creatures carried the weight of nations on their wings. By the end of World War II, the U.S. Army Signal Corps operated more than 50,000 pigeons. They delivered hundreds of thousands of messages across every front. In the jungles of Burma, the mountains of Italy, and the beaches of Normandy, they never failed to find their way home. When the war ended, the pigeon service was quietly disbanded. The age of radio and radar had begun. But for a few brief years, the fate of armies had rested on the wings of birds. And so, as America's dogs fought on land, and pigeons soared through the skies, another kind of soldier kept the U.S. campaign moving, slow, steady, and silent. In the mud of Asia and the mountains of Italy, men still relied on the oldest partners of war, the ones who carried the load when engines failed and wheels sank into the earth, the mules and horses, the forgotten logistical heroes. In an age of tanks, trucks, and jeeps, you might imagine horses had no place left on the battlefield. But in the early years of the war, when America's reach stretched into the most remote corners of the world, old allies found new purpose. In the jungles of Burma, on the cliffs of Italy, and across the mountains of the Philippines, horses and mules carried America's war on their backs. They were not glamorous. They did not charge into battle, but without them, much of the U.S. campaign would have ground to a halt. When the U.S. joined the China-Burma-India theater in 1942, it faced a logistical nightmare. There were no proper roads, no ports for heavy equipment, Every supply line ran through rivers, ravines, and rain-soaked jungle. Trucks could go only so far. Beyond that, it was up to muscle and willpower. So the Army called on the Quartermaster Corps and its faithful beasts of burden, the pack mules. From the American West, thousands were shipped overseas. Some came from the same stock once used by miners and ranchers in the Rockies. Others were captured from enemy lines, trained, and repurposed. A mule could carry nearly 250 pounds of food, ammunition, or medical supplies. They climbed steep hills, crossed rivers, and trudged through deep mud without complaint. When engines failed, the mules kept moving. When roads ended, they kept climbing. In the jungles of northern Burma, U.S. special units known as Merrill's Marauders depended on them entirely. The mules carried everything, radios, weapons, and rations for the men who marched hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines. They endured heat, disease, leeches, and exhaustion. Some never made it back. But when the Marauders reached their objective, Maitkina Airfield, their commander sent one of the simplest reports of the war. Mission accomplished. Thanks to the mules in Italy, the story was much the same. The terrain was brutal. Mountains split the front into impossible climbs. Roads were shattered by constant shelling. And yet, the supply lines held because they were carried on 4 hooves. Each night, mule trains crept along narrow trails under the cover of darkness. Ammunition boxes strapped to their sides. Artillery crews depended on them. Without them, no guns could be fed, no food delivered, no wounded carried back. Even horses, though fading from combat, still had their place. In the Philippines and New Guinea, cavalry units performed reconnaissance and supply runs. They patrolled areas where vehicles could not go, slipping quietly through terrain untouched by machines. One of the last American cavalry charges of the war took place in the Philippines in early 1942. Men of the 26th Cavalry Regiment, mounted on horses, faced Japanese tanks near Morong. They charged with rifles and sabers, not expecting to win, but to buy time for retreating infantry. They fought and died alongside their mounts. It was the end of an era, but also a final testament to centuries of partnership. As technology advanced, the horse gave way to the engine, but those who served with them never forgot. A veteran once said, "A mule doesn't ask for medals. He just keeps walking." And so they did. Through mud, snow, and fire, they carried the weight of men's hopes, one slow, steady step at a time. But while the land was filled with hoofbeats and the skies with wings, a different kind of animal story began to emerge, one hidden beneath the surface, one born in secrecy and shaped by the sea. In the final months of the war, the U.S. Navy began to study the behavior of marine mammals. Dolphins, seals, and sea lions, creatures long admired for their intelligence, were observed for potential use in underwater detection and recovery. It was not yet the Cold War. It was still the age of battleships and bombers, but the Navy was already thinking ahead. Reports suggested that dolphins could locate sunken mines or even lost equipment with remarkable accuracy. Their natural sonar, the Mabast biological equivalent of radar, fascinated naval scientists. Experiments began quietly along the California coast. The animals were never deployed in combat during World War II, but the seeds were planted. In the years to come, the U.S. Navy's marine mammal program would grow from these early wartime studies. It's hard to imagine now dolphins in service of war. But their story, like that of the dogs and pigeons, speaks to the same truth. In times of conflict, humanity turns to nature, seeking help from every living thing capable of understanding. Back on land, even the smallest creatures played their part. The home front, the farms, cities, and families of America became an unseen army of its own. And in that army, animals again stood beside people, working quietly in ways most never saw. Across the country, civilian families donated their pets for the war effort. The Dogs for Defense program asked Americans to loan their loyal companions to the military for training. Children cried as they handed over their dogs, hoping they would help win the war. Some never saw them again. Others received them back, trained, decorated, and changed. In factories and cities, cats kept warehouses clear of rats that could destroy vital food stores. Horses hauled scrap metal to collection points. Carrier pigeons were bred and trained by civilians for possible service. Even the zoos of America contributed, helping study animal behavior for training purposes. And then there were the mascots. Every ship, every unit, every airfield seemed to have one. A goat, a monkey, a cat, a dog, even a bear. They were symbols of home, reminders of a world beyond the battlefield. One Marine squad in the Pacific adopted a pig. They named him Corporal Shorty. Another, a Navy ship, kept a mischievous monkey that stole officers' caps. They didn't fight, but they made men laugh in places where laughter was rare. And that mattered. In war, morale can mean survival. Even the sight of an animal could remind soldiers of what they were fighting for, life itself. When victory finally came in 1945, the human world celebrated. Cities erupted in joy, flags waved, and bands played in the streets. But somewhere, in quiet kennels and empty barns, the animal soldiers rested too. Their war was over. Some returned home to the families that once raised them. Others were buried in faraway lands, their graves unmarked, their stories untold. But their legacy, the courage, loyalty, and sacrifice they gave without understanding why, endured. In time, memorials would be built. At Camp Lejeune, a bronze Doberman named Kurt stands eternal guard. In Guam, a marble wall lists the names of the Marine war dogs who never came home. And in cemeteries around the world, pigeons, mules, and even tiny Smokey the Terrier are remembered by those who know what they gave. They were America's forgotten soldiers, its silent warriors. They didn't march in parades, they didn't write letters home, but in foxholes, jungles, and stormy seas, they stood beside men who depended on them and never failed. Even today, the spirit of those animals lives on. The modern U.S. military continues to train working dogs, service horses, and detection animals. Their descendants serve in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond, carrying on a legacy born in the chaos of World War II. In the end, the story of America's animal heroes is not just about war, it's about loyalty, trust, and the simple, powerful bond between species that stood together when the world fell apart. They couldn't speak, they couldn't choose, but their actions spoke louder than words. And in that silence, they left behind a lesson that still echoes today. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world began to count its losses. Cities lay in ruins. Nations mourned their dead. And among the countless sacrifices made in that long and terrible war, there were those that few would ever mention. The dogs that had patrolled the jungles of Guam, the pigeons that had flown through gunfire over Italy, the mules that had carried the burden of armies through the mountains of Burma, and the little Yorkshire Terrier who had crawled through a pipe to save a runway and the men who depended on it. They had no medals pinned to their chests, no letters of thanks from generals, no graves tended by family. But in their own quiet way, they had helped shape the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. After the war, the U.S. military faced a new question. What would become of its animal soldiers? Some were returned to civilian life. Handlers and trainers worked to retrain them, helping them readjust to a world without gunfire or commands. Many dogs were reunited with the families that had donated them. Children waited at train stations watching for familiar faces and wagging tails to emerge from boxcars. It was a reunion born from both pride and heartbreak. Others never came home. They rested beneath foreign soil on islands and forests, beside airfields now long gone, their graves unmarked, but not forgotten. In the years that followed, memorials began to appear. At Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, a bronze statue of a Doberman, ears forward, eyes alert, was raised to honor the Marine Corps war dogs. His name is Kurt. He stands watch over a wall carved with the names of 25 fallen dogs who gave their lives on Guam in 1944. Each one remembered as a Marine. In Guam itself, another memorial was built, the War Dog Cemetery. Rows of plaques line a peaceful garden beneath the palms, where the names of those canine soldiers are etched in stone. Visitors still come to leave flowers, photos, and even dog tags. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, an exhibit displays the story of G.I. Joe, the pigeon who stopped a bombing run and saved 1,000 men. His tiny message capsule rests beside his preserved form, a reminder that courage sometimes comes on the smallest wings. And in Cleveland, Ohio, a small monument stands for Smokey. At its base, the words are simple: dedicated to Smokey, the Yorkie Doodle Dandy, and the dogs of all wars. Each memorial tells the same story, of loyalty beyond understanding, of creatures that served not for flag or glory, but because someone they trusted asked them to. As the decades passed, technology advanced. Machines took over where animals once worked, but their spirit remained. The U.S. military never forgot what they had learned from their animal soldiers, the lessons of teamwork, patience, and faith between species carried forward. Today, military working dogs patrol air bases, sniff out explosives, and protect their handlers in modern wars. Their training traces its roots directly back to those first war dog platoons of World War II. Even dolphins and sea lions now serve with the U.S. Navy, detecting underwater mines, recovering lost equipment, and guarding harbors. What began as an experiment in the 1940s has become a vital part of naval defense, a legacy born from curiosity, and carried forward by generations of trainers who see intelligence and courage in every animal they meet. Across America, from schools to museums, the stories of these animals are finally being told. Books, films, and memorial services remind new generations that victory was never won by humans alone. It was shared in with paws, wings, hooves, and fins. Because history is not only written by the hands that hold the rifles, sometimes it's written by those who run beside them. Imagine for a moment a soldier in a rain-soaked foxhole in 1944. Beside him, a dog sits quietly, ears twitching at every sound. The man is exhausted, cold, and afraid. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. That simple presence, that shared heartbeat in the dark, is enough. That moment, that bond is what defined them both. In a war of machines, these animals brought something deeply human: trust, instinct, love. They bridged the gap between fear and courage, between the chaos of battle and the quiet strength to keep going. And when the last shots were fired and the world began to heal, the memory of their service became a symbol of something greater. That even in war, the darkest of all human endeavors, compassion still had a place. That loyalty could exist without orders, and that courage can live in the heart of any living, thing, no matter how small. Today, if you visit the National War Dog Cemetery in Guam, you'll find it peaceful. The air is still. Birds sing softly from the trees. At the base of the bronze Doberman statue, someone has left a single collar. The tag reads only one word: Buddy. It's a fitting tribute, not to one animal, but to all of them. The dogs who guarded, the pigeons who carried messages through smoke and gunfire, the mules who climbed the mountains of Asia, the dolphins who learned to serve in silence, and the countless creatures that gave everything they had without ever understanding the cause they fought for. Their war is long over, but their story endures, because in the end, history doesn't just remember the battles won or the weapons used. It remembers the bonds formed, the lives saved, and the quiet acts of bravery that made victory possible. They were the silent soldiers, the loyal ones, the ones who asked for nothing and gave everything. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't salute, but when the call came, they answered.